Good morning everyone, welcome to the EduSat network. So friends, as part of our series on museology, in the last 2 days we have discussed museums in India as well as in Europe and their development from the various stages. Friends, today we are going to talk about new museology. It's a concept under which a building may not necessarily be a museum. A museum could also be a temple or say a village which is no longer inhabited by people. So this is what we are going to talk about, and for this discussion we have with us in the studio Dr. Anand Bardhan. He is a well-known name in the field of museology, and he has a number of publications to his credit. So let's welcome him and request him to share his ideas and the whole new concept of new museology. Welcome, sir.
Thank you and good morning to everybody. We have discussed in last 2 lectures all about the museum movement in Europe and the evolution and development of museums in India. In this context, it is also pertinent to have a discussion on the new museum movement. Before I am going to bring to the fore some of the very significant points of the new museum movement. I think it will be useful for all of my colleagues, scholars and students to know that new museum movement is actually all about the approach of bringing a cultural democracy in the world, and it is a way through that we have tried to identify and recognize all those methods and practices which actually aim cultural preservation of cultural objects, historical objects and the heritage buildings which are of invaluable universalistic significance. So as we know that a traditional museum is a kind of repository which has the aim to display objects for the purpose of cultivating awareness among people about art and also science and technology. However, the new museum movement is very different. Its aim is not to collect objects. Its aim is not to create a repository. Its aim is not to create a depository of objects. I mean to say, new museums are not object oriented like the traditional museums, or we should very specifically use the term Eurocentric model of museums. So new museums are very different from what we call the Eurocentric model of museums. In this context, I would like to quote a well-known museum scholar of the world, Moira Simpson, who says that though the word museum was not popular in every nook and corner of the world, but in every culture there has been a system of conserving, preserving and promoting heritage, and those kind of practices and methods which aim cultural preservationism, they should be identified and they should also be taken as means for preservation and promotion of heritage. Here it is I think inevitable to quote that the new museum movement is actually a reaction against the very process of museumizing objects. Why the practice of museumizing object has been opposed everywhere in the world? There is a reason, and the most important factor is that when you bring an object from a historical site or you bring it from a natural history site, you are definitely segregating the object from its cultural landscape, its parental environment, its native place, and this itself is an effort of damaging history. Its historicity is damaged. Once you bring an object from one particular historical site, that means you are deliberately doing an effort of bringing an object to the premises of museum, and by this you are definitely going to delete the very meaning and significance the object contains by being at one particular site. For example, if we are bringing an object from Khajuraho, it is like damaging the historicity of Khajuraho. So, the object should be preserved at the site only, and within its biophysical, chemico, environmental and cultural continuum. Here we should understand the fact that museum as a practice of segregating object from its original site is termed as musealia, and musealia is undoubtedly an unethical practice. It has some significance because if objects are scattered here and there, they definitely need a place to be preserved. But if an object is inseparable part of a particular cultural continuum, of a particular cultural environment, or of a particular heritage site or an archaeological site, its segregation is definitely unethical. So, the entire practice of museumizing object has received a very powerful intellectual challenge everywhere in the world, and the very method of acquiring object, procuring object by some invasive practices like excavation, like exploration, or like segregating object from its original continuum. These all practices to some extent are of course unethical, and they cannot be appreciated. I mean to say that archaeological exploration may be a good practice if it is being done scientifically. Excavation is very much required. Without that, you cannot know the cultural sequence, and historicity of a place cannot be revealed. But at the same time, there is need to preserve them at the site only, and not to bring them to metropolitan cities. So, the new museum movement actually focuses on one very basic issue related to preservation, and that is all about the in situ preservation of objects. So, this is the very cornerstone of new museum movement in the world, that objects should be preserved within its original environment, it should be preserved in situ, it should not be segregated from its original socio-environmental cultural continuum and brought to a museum in a metropolitan city only for the purpose of museumizing it in the name of preservation and in the name of display. Even if it has to be displayed, it should be displayed in situ. If it has to be preserved, it has to be preserved in situ. So, there is a paradigm shift in approach that one may understand, that earlier there was a practice of creating large size repositories. All big museums in the world, whether it is British Museum London or a Smolyan Museum, or it is Hermitage, or it is Louvre, all museums in the world, they were based on this idea that we should procure all the important articles by making certain efforts, and this policy of collection is going to help you in the growth of museum. But now the approach has thoroughly changed, and what we think that every object should be preserved at its original place, and this approach has been termed as really, in real sense, heritology. This word was coined by Professor Tamislav Sola. According to him, that in a local area, what is required is heritologically sustainable development, and this heritological sustainable development will be possible only if you are just not conscious about the preservation of environment, but also about the preservation and conservation of historical sites and the historical environment of a particular place. So, this practice has also been called heritology, and new museology is sometimes also understood as it is taken as heritology. Another important issue that is related to new museum movement is the very process of decolonization of Asia and Africa. We will have to understand this fact that European countries evolved museums as a hegemonic device to control culture, to impose some to impose the you can say colonially fabricated and designed cultural superiority on the people of a particular colony. So museum was not functioning with an objective purpose to present history in a systematic manner. They were generally guided by the ideology of the ruling political dispensation. Many times were guided by the colonial imperialistic approach. Many times they were guided by the idea of those people who were part of the bureaucracy. So new museum movement, as I have earlier also told, that it is a process of democratizing culture and accepting those practices which are popular and prevalent among the masses, and this is the region that new museology is also termed as people's museography. We will have to understand that museums cannot be in real sense the curator of culture. The curator of culture is always the community. The curator of culture is always the society. It is the society, it is the community, it is basically the people who conserve, preserve and promote culture. If the human civilization has survived, if values have survived, heritage has survived, culture has survived, traditions have survived, and they have become timeless reality, it is not because of museums, it is not because of cultural repositories, it is not because of depositories, curio cabinets, pinacotheques, it is only and only because of the collective memory of the people and the cultural practices of the people. So new museum focuses on people's museography, it focuses on all those social curatorial practices, those curatorial practices which have been responsible for survival and growth of culture and heritage in the world. If somebody is interested in taking an Indian example, if the temple traditions have survived to our age, or the ritual tradition have endured to our age, or music has survived to our age, or any sort of material culture has become immutable and inseparable part of our cultural life, till this date, it is not because of museums, but because of the collective memory of the people, and because of this very fact that people are guided by museum mindedness. This new museology as a phenomena, it is a phenomena and environment of conserving and preserving culture. For it, no building is required, even a territory can be a museum. So this is the fundamental difference which we will have to understand between an old museum and a new museum. Basically, what we can say, that new museum actually predates the traditional European kind of museum. When there was no museum in the world, there were new museums in the world. So the word has been, of course, been coined after 1970, but the practices about which we are talking, they have originated in time immemorial, and they are continuing from some ancient age to our period. These kind of practices were popular in Africa, these kind of practices were there in Australia, these of the practices were there in the region of Latin America, in South America, in a country like India, China, Japan, everywhere. There were monasteries where culturally significant objects were preserved. There were temples and shrines where objects were being preserved. There were parental houses where ancestral heritage houses in Africa where cultural objects were preserved. In Southeast Asia, there had been a tradition of creating heritage houses, and their cultural objects were preserved. And these objects were objects of great sanctity. We can take example of the Naga tribe, Konyak Nagas of India, where they made Morung as a heritage house, and it functioned as an open air museum. It also had a structure, a sacred structure, and where several cultural practices have sustained up to this particular period. So we will have to understand one very basic point about new museum is that new museum is not object oriented. It is basically you can say museum is not object oriented or collection oriented. It is basically heritage oriented, and here collection is not significant. What is significant here is the cultural practices of the people, and in this regard we must understand that with the decolonization of Asia and Africa, people realized that in their countries there were so many indigenous traditions, which traditions are of great cultural value and significance. They have cultural landscape, they have culturally vibrant sacred complexes, and sacred complexes, cultural landscape, and even we can say villages and shrines and sacred ponds together, they form an unique environment, a unique territory where different kind of vegetals, different kind of cropping pattern, different kinds of ritual practices, different kinds of ceremonial art survive, and without that people cannot expect to grow. If people survive in this world, they survive not because of all with a materialistic approach only, and with all means of comfort. They need an ideal cultural environment. So basically, new museum is all about an ideal cultural environment where people live with art, they practice art, they live with art, and through different indigenous and traditional methods, they preserve their own heritage. There is no curator, there is no bureaucrat, there is no technocrat, there is no technical assistant, there is no funding, there is no government building, there is no hegemonic device for controlling all these affairs. It is people oriented. So what we can say that new museum is a people oriented museum, and it will be very correct to quote here that new museum is for the people, of the people, and by the people. This definition of democracy is applicable to the new museum movement, because in new museums the role of people is much more important. We can take example, a very unique example of the French National Park, and Hughes de Verin, the person who evolved this eco museum, the term eco museum, was well aware of the world environmental movement, which had become very powerful during 1970. So it was realized as a movement for environmental preservation that environment of a particular village, of a particular territory, of a particular geographical area, that should be conserved and preserved by people's participation. We can say that new museum movement is an offshoot of this world environment movement, because the idea is linked to the idea of preserving heritage for the posterity, is linked to the concept of preserving environment for the posterity. And this idea of eco museum, I should quote that the word eco museum is very popular in the world, and the eco museum is a very unique concept where people think of preserving the ecology and environment of a particular place with all its biotic and abiotic element, and the idea is that if people will not preserve that environment or ecology of that particular area, sustaining life in that region will become difficult. So the concept of eco museum is part of the environmental museum. And what an eco museum is? Eco museum is not a building, eco museum is not a structure, it is not a walled structure, it is not having boundaries. Rather we can say that an eco museum is a territory, eco museum is name of an environment, eco museum is name of a particular geography area, it is a geographical terrain where some unique vegetables, plant, human being with a beautiful landscape, their agricultural practices, their traditional value system with their traditional method of preserving environment, live and practice those things which are still relevant. So, eco museum does not mean a museum that preserves only eco facts, rather it is a museum of environmental continuum. It is a museum which has a holistic approach to preserve heritage, environment and tradition together. In this new museum theory or eco museum theory, the role of community is supreme, and this is a buzzword that without people's participation the new museums cannot grow. In modern museum also, museum movement also, it is generally expected that people should play important role in curating culture, and to some extent in traditional museums also and modern art museums also such kind of practices, such kind of initiatives had been taken for preserving and promoting Chicano art and Hispanic art in America, the traditional art of the native people of America. The local people were invited in the museum to guide people, to tell them about painting, to work as guides. In India also, in Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Sangrahalaya, Rashtriya Manav Sangrahalaya Bhopal, the community people, they are invited and they guide us, they guide the visitors, they make display the way they want, they create their ceremonial art and ritual art in the museum. So, new museum theory has also influenced the old museum practices, the traditional museum practices in the world, and to some extent the Eurocentric museums are also trying to accommodate and incorporate this particular idea. However, we will have to understand the remarkable difference that we have in between new museum and old museums. One thing which is really very impressive, and that should definitely be understood by every learner, every practitioner and every scholar of museum, that a traditional museum generally believes in conserving and preserving tangible heritage. Contrary to it, new museum focuses on tangible as well as intangible heritage. So, in this way, new museum is more important for people, because tangible heritage is only a small part of the total heritages which we have inherited, which we have. So, preserving the material culture of the people or material evidences of the people, or what is there in form of object, that is not in itself a very, very holistic approach to deal with heritage, to deal with environment, to deal with cultural continuum. And new museum theory has definitely a very, very prolific, it is a very holistic concept, in that nature, environment, culture, tradition, art forms and music, dance, drama, rituals, they all have been incorporated. They all are brought under the purview of a new museum or an eco museum. So, the most remarkable difference that somebody can find between an old museum or the traditional museum and the new museum is that old museum mainly concentrate on objects made of a stone, which have actually tangible form, means objects made of wooden, paintings, manuscripts, objects made of leather and parchment, objects which are there in form of decorative art, objects which are there in form of industrial art, objects which can be really be visualized. But in a new museum, what we find that the heritage which is there in intangible form, For example, I can say, if a particular landscape has a particular color effect in the morning, no museum can actually create that environment within its galleries. You can use some methods, modern methods. You can use laser holographic technique. You can use optical fiber technique in a museum. You can use different kind of cinematographic technique in a old museum, in traditional museum, to create such kind of effect. But that will be an artificially designed environment. This we will have to understand, that old museums can create artificially designed and fabricated environment where people cannot have realistic feel, the feel of the real environment. New museums doesn't believe in using equipment. New museums, they don't believe in introducing different implements. We don't believe in showcasing things. New museums don't believe in making panels, making showcases, arranging pedestals. I mean to say, they can be part of that, but they are not necessarily required for that. We don't need buildings, we don't need walls, we don't need showcases, we don't need labels, we don't need even environmental panels. And one thing which is of supreme significance, who are coming to see our museum, who are coming to relish our environment, who are coming to enjoy the beauty of our village heritage or the community heritage, it is not a matter of supreme concern for us. For traditional museums, visitors are definitely very important. We keep a data sheet, we create a data sheet that how many visitors have visited our museum in this particular year, how many visitors had visited in the previous year. But this approach is not applicable to new museum. Here visitors are not important, important is the local community. And one thing which is very important, very significant regarding this museum is that people themselves are conservators, people themselves are preservationists, people themselves are curators, people themselves together with collective decision and by concerted effort think of preserving the originality of the environment, or originality of the local environment, and also with their genuine interest by using the traditional practices and method, they preserve the heritage of that local area as well. In this respect, we will have to understand the idea of cultural preservation as well. Cultural preservation is also a new word that has been coined in respect to people's approach of conservation. One thing which we will have to understand, that conservation as a theory and practice is all about mechanical and chemical intervention into heritage. This is an invasive practice, but cultural preservation is a non-invasive practice. We don't believe in destroying anything, adding anything, deleting anything, fabricating anything, using any new material for the purpose of conservation, because these all practices actually will definitely damage the sanctity of the heritage, the originality of the heritage, the you can say ancient historic element of the historic fabric of that particular object, that particular structure. We are nobody to damage the historic fabric of a heritage structure, of a heritologically significant or vibrant environment. So cultural preservation is an idea that by using different cultural practices and historically significant practices, we can think of preserving the environment, and the people themselves being aware of those practices can take initiative of preserving it. We can take some examples to understand the fact. In India's temple tradition and ritual tradition, There have been systems of Kumbhabhishekam. This had been popular in South Indian temples. Tirumanjanam is another system of preserving and conserving temple that has been popular in the Vaishnav shrines of South India. And in these practices, ritual practices, chandan, sandalwood, camphor and haridra, haldi, turmeric, also some other herbals, they are used. There is a proper recipe for that, and these herbal herbs have some medicinal value. They are applied on the monument, they are applied on the sculptures, and by that way what happens, the salt accretion is removed, the dust and dirt is cleaned. There is method of mechanical cleaning also, application of curd, application of pure water, application of some other ritual materials. They also help in conserving and preserving the method. So, no chemical is required for cultural preservation, no interventionist approach is required for that, no mechanical method of cleaning is required even for that. There is no need of adding new material to the cultural fabric, the heritage fabric of the old buildings. So, what is required? It is required that people should continue there, they should think of preserving their tradition and have regards for their value system, and by those traditional practices, by those indigenous method, by those herbal methods, by those you can say time tested methods. Basically all these practices are time tested methods, they are timeless realities. So, cultural preservation is again a holistic and people oriented approach, in that chemical intervention is not, application and intervention is not required. People themselves can think of preserving environment as well as heritage. So, what are the three significant aspects of this new museum movement that we will try to understand? First important thing is people's heritage. Second important thing is environment. Third important element is community participation. So, this new museum serves as a data bank of the local cultural practices, data bank of local tradition, data bank of local art, the folk art, data bank of folk narratives, data bank of oral history, data bank of the religious tradition, data bank of the oral tradition, data bank of traditional dance, drama and music. And in this way you can say new museum believes in creating a very comprehensive data bank of what is regional, what is local, what is indigenous, what is linked to community and its memory. We will have to understand one very important point about museum movement as well, that when this particular theory of museum movement evolved, there were critics as well who said that how can this new museum movement grow, and as part of it there was organized a special session that is known Guwahati session, in that the new museum proposal was accepted in India also. New museum theory was accepted and appreciated in the general annual conference of Museum Association of India, and it was decided that Museum Association of India will also work for the growth of new museums in the country. However, we have not been able to make a significant contribution to the field of new museum. We are actually supposed to discuss first what has happened in Europe. So, we will take a few European examples, very especially example of Germany, where many of the villages had been deserted long back because of rapid urbanization. And industrialization, and these deserted villages were having very beautiful structures. They were having beautiful houses, village gardens, village ponds, village churches, and of course the arable land was also there. So, many of the German people living in urban areas, they realized that villages were their homelands in real sense. They remembered many of the village traditions. Another important issue was the idea to preserve those villages from where they belong, because they were guided by some sort of nostalgia. This nostalgia for the village and rural culture, that was a very key point, that was a very basic point in the new museum movement in Germany. And we know that in Germany several villages, which were actually been deserted, they were treated as heritage villages, and the houses, the buildings, the ponds, the community halls, village churches, village roads, streets, they all were preserved by those people who belong to that village. And there evolved a system of preserving the environment and heritage of the villages, and these museums are known as Heimat museums. In English we can call it as homeland museums. So in Germany there had been a very, very powerful new museum movement. If somebody is interested in knowing the new museums history in France, France has been actually one of the first countries in Europe where the French National Park was being preserved. This park had heritage structures, small lakes, particular vegetational pattern. It had a very distinct physiography, and all these elements, all these aspects of the local environment and heritage made French National Park very, very remarkable place in terms of environment, culture, history and heritage. So it was thought that the rejuvenation of this park, of this area in many ways is required, and government alone cannot preserve the entire heritage of the country. This is also a very significant point of the new museum movement, that no governmental agency, no you can say state can play very vital role in preserving people's heritage. So what is required is people's initiative. And what has happened in Germany, it was because of people's initiative that Heimat museums were created. What was happening in France, that people realized, though government had taken the initiative, but people, people working for preservation and conservation of French National Park required, if local community is not involved in preservation of heritage and preservation of environment, preservation of monument, preservation of archaeological site, preservation of cultural landscape, government cannot create a force. Government cannot create an order which can really took initiative and proper measures for preserving the heritage. So we will have to educate people. What we can do, we can cultivate awareness against people. And people, if people are enlightened, if they are going to think in that direction, the tradition of different regions, the culturally significant territories of different countries, they can be preserved and they can be protected, they can be well protected. One thing which we will have to understand at this juncture, that new museum is not an orthodox idea. We should not take it as an orthodox idea that people will do. People will definitely need training also in many ways. So what government can do? You cultivate awareness among the people, you can train people, you can educate people, you can organize workshops for people, you can organize seminars for them, you can organize training camps for them. So some sort of training is requirement, but let people come in the lead role. Let people come at the front and let them think and decide what they can do for their own cultural territory. So the government's role should be passive. Government's role should be that of an agency that will inspire people in doing that. The government's role will be that if people really need fund, government should provide fund. Government role should be that if people need training, government should create opportunities so that people can have training, and this has happened in countries of Latin America, in several countries of South Africa like Ecuador. There had been in Chile, where many old villages of the native people, the physical setting of the villages, the physiographic structure of the villages, the riverine environment of those villages, the hilly landscape of those villages, the cropping pattern of those villages, the traditional value system of those villages, traditional art and craft of the villages were so peculiar, so vibrant, aesthetically so charming, that government really realized that there is need to preserve them. It is heritage that reveals history. It is tradition that reveals history. You can peep into history through village tradition, through local traditions. So, these old museums can offer you only and only visual delight. Through them, you can construct past, but you cannot relish and realize what kind of life was there in the past. But if there is a new museum, people's museum, what we can call them, new museums are basically people's museum. New museums are not government museum. New museum is not a device. It is rather an open environment. It is museum without walls. The very proper term that we can use for new museums is that new museums are museums without walls. There are cultural, environmental continuums where people preserve their heritage by those practices which are ingrained in their psyche, which are part of their life. And this happened in those countries where there is a large number of people who believe in living with their past, where present and past is well linked because of the enduring tradition. This has not been in the case only the case in America. In Mexico also, the Indians of Mexico or Indians of America and the first citizen of Canada, they have tremendous the practices of tremendous artistic and aesthetic value. The Inuit art of Canada is ultimately what? It is the art which originated long back, and it has maintained its aesthetic ingenuity. That aesthetic ingenuity can be preserved only and only by these new museums, because people feel that what is old is a subject of great sanctity for them. In Africa and South America also, we can find that people have made effort to revive those shrines, the traditions of those shrines and those practices which were earlier being treated as the practices of the bygone era, or which were being considered as outdated practices. But there is a movement, and what people feel that the old tradition, the old practices, the old methods of conservation, the old religious values, they all should be proper place in human life, and they are very much required, because the people who live in that area can very much link with those practices, and they may feel very proud of that community which had evolved all kinds of sacred tradition. Now we will try to understand this new museum movement also in Indian context. I can say that a proper study is required in Indian context, because we have several kinds of institutions in our country which can be equated to the new museum theory. I would like to quote Rabindranath Tagore first, and I believe that much before G.H. Riviere and Hughes de Verine, these two great genius museologists who evolved the new museum theory and the eco-museum theory, Rabindranath Tagore had realized that we need villages. We will have rather to revive those villages where art is practiced by every human being. we will have to revive and rejuvenate villages where art is integral to life, where people live with art, where people know how to cultivate land, how to make barren fields, transform barren field into arable land, where people in long course of their stay have taken recourse to a particular type of lifestyle, where aesthetic creativity is ingrained in human psyche, and every village has a very beautiful, distinct environment, and this environment is created by the people. People play a very important role in that. Physical setting is of course very significant. Physiography is of course very significant. But why people have settled in that particular area, what they have learned from that environment, how they have learned to live with that environment, and what is the impact of environment, sum total of the impact of the environment on people and life culture of that particular area. This we should understand. And one thing which is very remarkable of museum movement is the economic viability. If some people are staying in their area, that area must have a self you can say sustainable economic life also. Self-sustained villages are very much required. And this concept Rabindranath Tagore has thought about self-sustained villages where aesthetic creativity of the people could have been promoted, can be promoted, and that itself will make their life meaningful. So with this particular idea, Rabindranath Tagore had decided to create Sri Niketan. Sri means Lakshmi, Sri means also Saundarya, beauty and prosperity. Beauty and prosperity are in many ways integral part of each other. So a beautiful village must be a prosperous village, and a village is prosperous, it will definitely be beautiful. So environment, economic prosperity, aesthetic creativity, these are some of the basic components of new museum movement, and we should be proud of this fact that Rabindranath Tagore tried to disseminate this idea in the villages of Bengal or villages around Shanti Niketan, that how by promoting our old aesthetic, cultural, religious practices we can make life beautiful. Mahatma Gandhi, I would like to quote Mahatma Gandhi also, though Mahatma Gandhi's name is not taken in respect to new museum movement, but Gandhi has once commented, which may be very pertinent for scholars who are working on new museum movement. And what is the comment of Mahatma Gandhi? Mahatma Gandhi once visited a textile museum, and then he said that I don't want a textile museum without a weaver. It should be not like a mere repository where objects of textiles, ceremonial textiles, and all beautiful textiles with embroidery work, with different kinds of design, with different kinds of colors, with different kinds of patchwork, they can be displayed here and there in the gallery, in the portico, and its corridors. Mahatma Gandhi rather said how a weaver practices art. It should also be shown. People should come to museum to visualize that what sort of love this weaver is having for this very practice, this very art form, how women are engrossed and involved in doing the embroidery work. Their sensitive nerves and their aesthetic perceptibility, they work together and they create beautiful pieces of art. So people should not go museum only to see some pieces of art, rather the practice of art. So new museum is a museum which showcases, which actually focuses on the practice of art, the process of art, creating art, the process that evolves art, that process which creates art. So even Gandhi had this particular realization that museums of objects alone cannot serve the purpose of conserving and preserving heritage of the country, and we should also look into the very rich history of new museums in India. We can take example of the Brihadeshwara temple, which functioned as a new museum because Vedic education was imparted there. It had an Arogyashala, it has a Pon Bhandaram, it has a cultural repository, it's preserved the tradition of metallurgical art, it preserved the tradition of making palm leaf manuscripts, and people who were visiting to this space, they were seeing what was created in history. It's a new museum of architecture. We have a structure of Chola period, you have a structure there of Vijayanagar period, of Nayak period, and also of Maratha period. So one temple site shows to you the historic development of architecture. No museum can offer you such an opportunity. If you are going to the western group of temple of Khajuraho, you can see there the Jagdamba temple, you can see there the Lakshmana temple, you can see there the Chitragupta temple, and also the great Kandariya Mahadev. So the evolution of art can be understood at a temple complex, though that is dead, but you can have there a kind of heritage experience, aesthetic experience, which is not possible to for us to get within a traditional setup of museum. Similarly, whether it is monastery of Alchi or Lamayaru in the region of Ladakh, or the Vaishnav Satraj of Assam. Vaishnav Satraj of Assam are very significant structures and very significant examples of India's new museums in one way. They preserve the monastic tradition of the Vaishnavites in the region of Assam within a very distinct, peculiar riverine environment, because the Satraj are based on the Majuli island of the Brahmaputra river, and there were around 66 Satraj with their Namghar, their Paghar. They were having tradition of writing manuscripts. Sanchi Patta manuscripts was prepared there, Tulapat manuscripts were prepared there, mask art was very popular there. They were also practicing the bamboo art, and dance, drama, music, Ankiyan art tradition evolved there, Bhavana dance evolved there, Satriya Nritya practices were there. So within a small sacred territory of Majuli, so many great traditions which played a very exhilarating role, a very important role in the society of Assam. They survived there, and all important texts, they were compiled in the Vaishnav Satraj of Majuli only. So Vaishnav Satraj of Assam are wonderful examples of new museum. We can take another example from Indian subcontinent itself, India only, Arunachal Pradesh Tawang Monastery. This Tawang Monastery has a very rich collection of heritage. People participate there. They have a ritual tradition of preserving those manuscripts. There very good number of subject objects have been practiced. They have a large courtyard and compound where people go for different kinds of ceremonial practices. So whether it is the Tabang Monastery of Arunachal Pradesh, or Rumtek Monastery of Sikkim, or Likir Gompha, Lamayaru, and Alchi monasteries of Ladakh, Brihadeshwara temple, or the great Kalyan Sundareshwar temple of Madurai, Meenakshi Sundareshwar temple of Madurai, where a very good number of practices are there which actually can be termed as people's museography. We can take another example from Bihar, where the Bodh Gaya Mutt had well preserved the great number of Buddhist images. It is a matter of great pride that the monastery was established by follower of Shankaracharya, but it had preserved the images related to Lord Buddha and to Buddhism, and they have preserved it by using traditional method. They have showcased, they have displayed them, and people who go there, and apart from that, they had been very good number of manuscripts and later they had established a library of manuscripts also in Varanasi for cultural studies. So one may find a very good number of examples of those traditional kind of museums. For that this new museum, this particular term can be applicable, and we are concerned now also about creating eco museums, and at Lakshadweep an eco museum has been created because of the very particular, very distinct physical setting and environment that place contains. So new museum movement has become significant for India, and there is need to identify those cultural institutions of the country where community participation is very important, and people have played very dynamic role in preserving their heritage. One more example I would like to take, because I personally visited that site with a great museum theorist, Dr. Bedekar, and the village, this is a village known as Korlai village, and it is on the western coast near Alibag, and this village is a very important village, because Portuguese settlers had reached to that village. They stayed there, Arabs had stayed there, also other Europeans had also stayed there, indigenous communities were also there, and now you have a, you can say, a very composite kind of culture in that particular village. There are Hindus, there are Muslims, there are Christians, but they have this feeling they all belong to Korlai community, and this is a unique village with Maratha fort, some old temples. At Rodanda village they have preserved the traditional system of cropping, and the environment of that particular area, the coastal environment of that particular area, heritage environment of that particular area, it is very unique, and Bedekar considered it as a very good example of new museum in India. Thank you very much, and I hope that people must have been benefited by this discourse.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful presentation, and through this we were introduced to a new concept called the new museology, and as sir told us, new museum is that which focuses on the practice of art, and it's a people oriented museums. So sir, if I could slide in a quick question, are the new museums that you gave a number of examples within India, are they also not funded? Are they maintained just by people who live there, or is it sanctioned by the government?
No, in India government has not taken initiative for inspiring people who can play a very important role in preserving the local heritage. No such initiative has been taken in India, but in other parts of the world, we can take example of America, where a new concept has been developed. They call such kind of museums as neighborhood museums. Actually, it is part of the traditional museum, but what these traditional or Eurocentric museums are doing for communities, they create a neighborhood museum. They provide all different kinds of educational and cultural services to the people by opening these museums. So new museum is a very broad concept. Numerous kinds of museums activities and practices can be brought under its purview.
Right. So sir, just I'd like your approval on this, that we can also then say that homes of probably famous writers or famous leaders that have been preserved as repositories of their objects, say probably Nehru's home or some famous writers, of course their homes have been preserved as such within the US as well. So they can also be called as new museums?
No, we call them Personalia Museum because it focuses on one particular person. New museum is a very holistic concept, it's a very broad concept where environment, heritage, cultural traditions together combinedly they are preserved and promoted by the local communities.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. And as we draw to the end of the lecture with little or no time left with us, we'd like to thank you, sir, for being here and for conducting this series on museology, and also the viewers for watching. So thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you.